For Comedy Hype News, I'm Travis Adonis. When vaudeville was in its prime, black entertainers were subjected to conditions less than ideal. While some black artists in today's day and age still struggle to achieve some of the same opportunities that are given to their white counterparts, most of the progress made can be attributed to the old theater artists who paved the way. There's Pigmeat Markham, Burt Williams, Miles Mabley, Tim Moore, and of course Bill Robinson, who went by the name of Bojangles. Bojangles was one of the first black vaudeville performers who refused to put on blackface. In the early 1900s, black entertainers could only perform in pairs. Bojangles was one of the first black performers who take the stage by himself. He was the first black entertainer to appear in Hollywood film as part of an interracial dance with Shirley. In addition to his trailblazing career of breaking racial barriers, Bojangles was also an influence to many in his personal and offstage life. Bojangles got the Dallas Police Department to hire its first black policeman. He fought for equal treatment for black soldiers during World War II, staged the first integrated public event in Miami, among several other accomplishments. Despite all he did for blacks coming up in the first half of the 20th century, he was still subjected to Uncle Tom and sellout comparisons. That's Bill Bojangles Robinson, a story you should know. Born Luther Robinson, May 25, 1878 to Maxwell and Maria Robinson in Richmond, Virginia. Robinson was the first of two boys and showed talent from as young as 7, dancing for pennies outside local theaters. Sources say his parents died in either 1884 or 1885. His father from chronic heart disease and his mother from unknown natural causes. Young Luther and his brother Bill were subsequently taken in by their paternal grandmother Bedelia Robinson, a former slave who struggled to show the boys any kind of love. Robinson and his brother were effectively homeless by age 10 after their grandmother actively sought to relinquish her custody of them. Robinson's biographer James Haskins wrote, "Bill was present during the conversation between Judge Crutchfield and his grandmother. It must have been traumatic to the women he loved the most to list the reason why she should not take her son's children." Mr. Bojangles, page 29. After that meeting, both of the Robinson's boys temporarily lived with Judge Crutchfield, a community leader because of his compassionate disciplinary approach with children, until a permanent guardian was found. One of Robinson's childhood antics was recounted in his biography, Mr. Bojangles, where a young Robinson stole a fish and was apprehended by the police in front of Judge Crutchfield. After returning the stolen merchandise, the judge turned to Robinson and said, "Next time, either steal a smaller fish or get a longer coat." As a child, Luther Robinson hated the name because he was the butt of so many jokes. He annoyed, then bullied, and eventually beat up his little brother and literally stole his name, going by Bill from then on. His brother took his old name Luther, but eventually changed his name again to Percy, a name his little brother used professionally as a musician. Once Robinson and his brother left their grandmother's home, Robinson became a street kid, like something you see in Little Rascals. He quit school after 2nd grade and took up with a boy 4 years younger than him named Edgy Eggleston. The pair did whatever they could for money, including busking and shoe shining in Richmond's wealthy white downtown along Broadway. Eggleston said the pair danced without music to the tune of their own songs, created drum beats by emphasizing consonant sounds. Robinson didn't know it at the time, but he had already stumbled upon what would be his livelihood by the age of 13, despite vehement opposition from his grandmother. Although she was no longer the official guardian of him and his brother, she remained a stable presence in their lives. Mrs. Robinson was an intensely devout Christian who viewed dancing or any acts of pleasure as devil worship. But the young Bill Robinson didn't care. Haskins wrote, "Once Mrs. Robinson relinquished her custody, all family life was gone for Bo." Robinson eventually left Richmond after an older white singer-dancer, Lemuel Toney, who would eventually become Eddie Leonard, convinced Bill to hop on the freight train and go back to Washington, D.C. Toney proposed to develop a song and dance routine where Big and Eggy would become pickaninnies. The term pickaninny originated from the West Indies, meaning small child. The word has been used in North America as a racial slur, referring to dark-skinned black child. Robinson was keen but shrewd, asking, "With what money?" Toney flashed a $20 bill, and the two hopped on the freight train to D.C. The offer to travel was extended to Edgestone as well, but he chose not to go, citing the guilt for disobeying his parents. His decision not to travel remained a talking point for Robinson for the rest of his life. Eggleston said, "Bill would tell people he's a boy who tried to make something of himself, but he wouldn't come with me." When Robinson and Toney made it to D.C., neither of them did any dancing. Tony started working with the Baltimore Orioles baseball team before being discovered by the famous minstrel performer George Primrose, and Robinson rubbed down horses at Bennings Racetrack, even considering a career as a jockey. Eventually, Robinson got his break in 1892 when he was offered work in a minstrel show called The South Before the War as a pickaninny. His luck didn't last long though, because at his age, he could only play a credible pick for a year or so before he was too old to assume the role credibly. Life was rough for Robinson as a teenager. When he couldn't find traditional work, he was forced to steal bread and milk from doorsteps and sell newspapers and dance on street corners just to make sure he wouldn't go hungry or have to live outside. On March 21st, 1908, Robinson was arrested in New York City for armed robbery. A tailor had accused him of robbing him at gunpoint. 6 months later, he was convicted and sentenced to 11 to 15 years hard labor and charged with robbery, grand larceny, and assault, all in the first degree while criminally receiving stolen property. According to the book Bill Bojangles' Robinson Dancer, the tailor's name was Hyman Sussman, who had been Robinson's tailor for 8 years. However, when it came time for the trial, Sussman claimed he did not know Robinson at the time of the crime. According to the book, Robinson had given Sussman a $5 deposit on a $50 overcoat. When the overcoat was stolen from the shop, Robinson demanded his $5 back because it was gone. Robinson's story claims that he only demanded his deposit back, but Sussman says that Robinson actually stole the coat and was carrying a gun. When Sussman gave Robinson his $2 back, he began yelling, "Don't shoot me." As a result, bystanders restrained Robinson until police arrived. Robinson didn't take the trial seriously. The fact that he did not have a gun and knew Sussman prior to the incident was not presented in the trial, and no witnesses were called on Robinson's behalf. The jury eventually found him guilty and he was sent to Sing Sing, a correctional facility 30 miles north of New York City. Robinson knew that Sussman was lying and thought the judge and jury would see clearly through his story. One of Robinson's partners at the time, George Cooper, hired a new attorney for him, who provided evidence that Robinson was falsely accused. This led to his exoneration and his accusers were indicted for perjury. When Robinson was released from prison, he registered his pistol at the local police station in each town he performed in. In the process, he formed a song and dance duo with another white youth and tried to sell more newspapers. That boy would go on to be a legend in American show business, Al Jolson. Robinson tried to form his own headline show, but vaudeville producers at the time enforced the so-called two-color rule, which didn't allow blacks to perform solo acts. In his early career, Robinson teamed up with several other black performers, including George W. Cooper, Theodore Miller, amongst several others. After splitting with Miller in 1914, Ray Samuels, a fellow performer in traveling shows, encouraged Robinson to meet with her husband, Marty Forkins, as a potential manager. Robinson accepted Forkins' offer, and under him became the first black solo act in American theater, breaking the two-color rule and setting the precedent for black vaudevilles from that moment on. They achieved this by essentially lying, telling producers and stage managers Robinson was already a solo performer at lower levels. Through World War I, Robinson worked with the Orpheum and Keith stage companies to perform moral shows for black and white units and expeditionary forces. As a result, he was granted a commendation and was not drafted. After the war and through the 20s, Robinson had a full-time contract with the Orpheum and Keith circuits. It was during this time that he began performing under the stage name Bojangles. There are several stories that predict how Robinson settled on the name he claimed he got from childhood. The book Vaudeville, Old and New, offers several explanations on how he could have went down. Was the character and name Bojangles a reflection of minstrel shows that depicted happy drakes performing for the white plantation owners, or simply a reflection of the happy-go-lucky ebullience that shrined from Bill on stage? Another alternative that was offered: when they used to dance on Richmond streets, Bill and his childhood partner Edgy stole a beaver top hat. The hatmaker's name was Lion J. Bujasin, which locals supposedly corrupted to Bojangles. Bill wore the top hat and neighborhood kids took to calling him Bojangles. Robinson's childhood runabout, Edgy Eggleston, put it this way: one day a beaver disappeared. A beaver was a tall hat, you. Now that beaver disappeared and we, between the two of us, we couldn't sell it. So I saddled the thing on Bill. It became a joke in the street. Who took Bojangles' hat? Someone asked. Well, Bojangles took it, and we pointed at Bill. According to vaudeville entertainer Tom Fletcher, the word Bojangles was a combination of bo, meaning a dapper dude, and jangle, meaning to squabble or wrangle. Bill was always dressed very nicely, but he was often quick to take offensive and wouldn't hesitate to use his fist or a gun when he felt slighted. He was a last-minute addition to the fledgling production called Blackbirds of 1928 and enlivened it, single-handedly turning the show from a flop into a hit that ran more than a year. Being that Blackbirds was a black show for white audiences, Bojangles Robinson became an instant crossover celebrity at the time when such an achievement was reserved for athletes. Remember that stair dance I brought up earlier? It turned out to be the most significant part of his act throughout his career because it encompassed all of the aspects that made him a revolutionary figure in professional dance. Pete Nugent, a leading tap dancer at the time, remarked that Robinson was the tops in control. He was the father of tapology. Legend has it Robinson integrated the technique into his act when he danced down the steps at the side of the stage at the Palace Theater in 1918 to greet friends to the audience during the performance. However, if Eggleston's recollection of their childhood's antics on the steps of Richmond's police station is true, stair dancing came naturally to Robinson well before the conscious choice to make it his signature routine. Dancers at the time found his appropriation of the dance problematic. You see, prior to World War II, art and entertainment were distinctively separate. Artists existed in rarefied space reserved for genius. Inventiveness and claims to intellectual property were respected and observed. For example, in music, an artist couldn't just rip a riff without crediting and paying the originator and expect to keep his reputation intact. Other forms of entertainment such as comedy and dance didn't operate under the same principle. They were considered technicians of a sort. Everyone knew the tricks of the trade. They all had the same tools in their toolkit, and they simply used the right tools for the job to make each gig as effortless as possible. As a result, Robinson found himself in a professional quagmire with himself at the center. Vaudeville dancers, much like their comedic peers, had an understanding that even though they all rotated the same routines, no single routine would be repeated in the same show, which created an issue when performers didn't travel in groups as companies, but individual contractors who show up for a night in a random city. No one knows who else is on the show until they get there, and even then, they didn't know the routines in each other's acts until they perform. Somehow, through all of the controversy, he was credited with originating the dance. Robinson's biographer, James Haskins, gives an explanation for his triumph and the struggle for credit. What distinguished Bill Robinson's stair dance was showmanship. His stair dance, when perfected, involved a different rhythm for each step, each one reverberating with a different pitch. And the fact that he had a special set of portable steps enhanced his claim to originating the dance. Robinson went so far as to submit an application to the U.S. Patent Office for the dance, which was ultimately rejected, but the lack of legal protection didn't undermine his claim to sole ownership of it. One of his contemporaries, Fred Stone, sent him a check for $1,500 and a letter which read, "In part payment of the stair dance I stole from you." By the 1930s, live performances increasingly passed as motion picture productions became popular. Being the premier hustler he was, Robinson made the shift with industry and secured his role as the leading black male actor when there weren't any. I mean, let's be honest, how long can you tap dance for white folks before it's time for a change? Robinson secured his first leading role in 1932 by playing himself in the first modern film with an all-black cast called Harlem is Heaven. It was a financial disaster, but as an early adopter of the new medium, Robinson was able to transition to big-budget Hollywood films with relative ease, becoming a frequent co-star to Shirley Temple, the first being 1935's The Little Colonel. When it was decided that Robinson and Temple would share the screen together, producers wanted him to perform his famous stair dance routine with her. However, Robinson quickly realized that it would be difficult to teach the dance to a 7-year-old in a few days' time, so he adjusted and taught her a different dance instead. After watching Temple attempt the dance move, Robinson changed his choreography to match Temple's, where it appeared that she was imitating him, instead of the other way around. This dance sequence is often considered the highlight of the film. Robinson and Temple became the first interracial dance partners in Hollywood history. The scene was controversial at the time. causing several movie theaters in the South to cut the dance along with any other scene where the two made physical contact. Temple and Robinson would go on to make 3 other films: The Little Rebel, Rebecca and the Sunnybrook Farm, and Just Around the Corner. Reflecting on her time working with Robinson, she said, "Bill Robinson treated me as an equal, which was very important to me. He didn't talk down to me like a little girl, and I like people like that. And Bill Robinson was the best of all. We held hands, and I learned to dance from Bill by listening, not by looking at his feet. It was a kind of magic between us." Shirley Temple. Film historian Donald Bogan noted that black audiences had mixed feelings towards Robinson and Temple's films. According to him, blacks were happy to see that he was working in Hollywood, breaking several barriers, but didn't like the image he was letting on. He is this kind of quintessential on-screen Tom figure. Some opponents felt that was an unfair characterization of Robinson's work, citing his role as Uncle Billy in The Little Rebel with Shirley Temple was the first black man made guardian of a white life, unlike roles played by Stephen Fitchett. Those close to Robinson also felt that Uncle Tom label was too harsh a criticism to levy against Robinson. Childhood friend Edgy Eggleston recalls that in the early days of their show business careers, when blackface was common, even for black performers, Robinson never wore the makeup. And U.S. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, who eulogized Robinson at his funeral, said during the service, "In some way, the legend got around that Bill was an Uncle Tom. You didn't know Bill if you heard that story." I was talking to some of the boys in Duke Ellington's band, and they were telling about a place where they were playing in the Midwest, and they went around the corner on a cold day between shows to get some coffee and donuts, and the owner said, "We can't serve you here." Bill was on the bill with them, and they came back and told the story. And Bill said, "What?" Bill grabbed his pearl-handled gold gun and went around the corner. He said to them, "Come on, fellas." They went around the corner and packed into this place and sat down, and Bill laid his pearl-handled gold gun on the counter and said, "Coffee and donuts." They had coffee and donuts. Robinson spent the last decade of his life making radio and television appearances. On November 25, 1949, he died penniless due to heart failure at the age of 71. The funeral was paid for by Ed Sullivan. Bill Bojangles Robinson suffered the same stigma as Stephen Fitchett, Matt Moreland, and several others who were subjected to, looked at as someone who reinforces and perpetrates negative stereotypes about African Americans. What was once thought of as endearing, non-threatening entertainment is now called cooning and being an Uncle Tom. During this time period, actors virtually had no chance of success in the industry without playing these roles. Despite the negative reactions he got, Bojangles still became a pioneer to those in the vaudeville era, and his contributions to black people are still felt decades after his passing. For Comedy Hype News, I'm Travis Adonis.